Some say the music was cursed. Others say it was grief given rhythm. But one thing is certain, the dance is never truly over. It simply waits, silent, patient, until the next soul hears its song. And if tonight you find yourself humming a tune you don't remember learning, don't follow it, don't listen, and whatever you do, don't dance. Did you catch the real killer before Miss Marple did? Or did the music claim you too? Drop your theory below, and tell us which clue sealed it for you. Chapter 1. The invitation to Eversfield Hall. There are certain names that carry with them a kind of quiet burden. Eversfield is one such name. It does not shout, it does not demand attention, and yet when spoken aloud in certain rooms, especially those furnished in lace, mahogany, and quiet secrets, it silences conversation with a peculiar swiftness. It had been over 2 decades since Eversfield Hall had been spoken of at length in any respectable circle. 25 years, to be precise, since the music in its ballroom last rose to a crescendo. Since then the great hall had remained shuttered, its chandeliers left unpolished, its floorboards untouched by dancing shoes, and its silence unbroken, at least officially. And then, quite without warning, the silence was interrupted. It arrived one Thursday morning, in the form of a letter, a curious envelope, hand-addressed in a looping cursive and sealed with violet wax, the sort used more often in romantic novels than in real life. Miss Jane Marple, now some years retired from active curiosity, found it waiting on her tea-table beside a copy of the Times and a small vase of wilting narcissus. She took no more than a moment to examine it before slicing it open with the edge of her butter knife. Inside, the parchment was thick, folded twice, and faintly scented with gardenia too intentional to be perfume. It read, "Dearest Miss Marple, I do hope this letter finds you well. I write with a most delicate concern, one which may benefit from your particular experience. Eversfield Hall is to host its first masquerade ball in 25 years, a revival of sorts, and a reconciliation perhaps. Yet certain patterns have re-emerged, certain accidents. I would feel far safer were you to attend, not only as my guest, but in confidence. Something in the dance feels wrong this time, and I dare not speak of it more plainly in writing. With sincerity, Lady Georgiana Anstruther." Miss Marple, naturally, said nothing at first. She did not even blink. Instead, she reread the words and took a slow sip of tea, and in that moment, quiet, thoughtful, precise, she had already decided she would go. Eversfield Hall, after all, had always intrigued her. The journey to Devon was uneventful in the way that certain English journeys must be. Mist curled around the edges of hedgerows, the train wheezed gently as it pulled into the countryside, and the trees bowed ever so slightly, not from wind but from time. The driver sent to fetch her was a man of few words and fewer expressions. He wore a cap pulled low and gloves too white for the road, and when asked how long the ride would take, he merely nodded once, then turned back to the wheel. The first glimpse of Eversfield Hall came through a curve in the lane, a brief view framed by 2 yew trees and a stone gate carved with initials that had long faded to soft echoes. The house itself stood proud, but exhausted, ivy clinging to every wall as though trying to keep the place from sighing into the soil. Its many windows stared outward like watching eyes. None were open. The air held no scent of preparation, no sound of festivity, only stillness. Yet at the heart of it, the ballroom, tall, winged, sealed by iron-framed glass doors, was being made ready. And it was there Miss Marple was led first, her suitcase quietly taken by a girl with downcast eyes who whispered, "Don't listen to the music, it plays even when no one's there." The girl's name, as Miss Marple later learned, was Elsie, a maid, barely out of girlhood, with fingers that trembled and eyes that flitted toward shadows too quickly. She was not the only one with something unspoken. Lady Anstruther greeted her in the drawing-room, dressed in lavender and pearl, her face untouched by age, save for one deep line that ran between her brows, as though she'd spent decades squinting at truths too close for comfort. She kissed Miss Marple's hand, and spoke in warm tones, but her eyes flicked once-twice to the grandfather clock and the ballroom door beyond. "You understand, my dear Jane," she said gently, "why I couldn't write everything. Things have resumed, rhythms that mimic the past, and I don't trust memory here, least of all my own." Miss Marple did not respond. She merely listened, that slight tilt of her head indicating attention, calculation, restraint. They walked together through the corridor lined with ancestral portraits. One of a woman in crimson had a frame dusted with cobwebs, yet the feet in the painting showed no dust at all. It was the kind of detail Miss Marple rarely missed. Others had already arrived. Sebastian Anstruther, the host's son, greeted her with polite reserve. His features were handsome in a sculpted, deliberate way, but his expression rarely settled. He smiled too fast and dropped it too quickly. His role ostensibly was to restore the ballroom, though Miss Marple sensed that whatever work he had undertaken was more spiritual than structural. There was Irene Vale, a music teacher from Bath, or so she said, brought in to tune the grand piano that had sat untouched since the last dance. She played well, too well, with a kind of precision that missed warmth. Her gaze lingered too long on the keys, as though she expected them to move on their own. Then came Major Beckwith, retired from the service, though precisely which service was never quite clarified. He walked with a limp and watched others with the cautious eye of a man used to bunkers, not ballrooms. Dr. Langley, soft-spoken and pale, offered nothing more than pleasantries, and Mrs. Carmody, older than the rest, seemed present only by habit, as though she had once belonged to this world but had outlived her role in it. Supper was served promptly, though no one seemed hungry. Wine was poured, glasses lifted, but conversation stalled. And then, quite without warning, Irene was asked to test the piano. She approached it without hesitation, opened the lid, and struck a few notes. The sound rang sharp, then settled, clear, true, undeniable. She played a brief scale, a few bars of a familiar piece, then paused, her hand hovering over the final chord. She did not play it. Instead, she stood up, nodded once, and stepped away. That was when it happened. No one touched the keys, and yet music, slow, elegant, unmistakably a waltz, began to play. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was not mechanical, no machine was operating. The pianist's hands were still, and yet the melody moved, measured, graceful, patient, a single phrase, then silence. Miss Marple turned to the others. No one had spoken, no one had moved. The air had changed. Someone was listening. In the aftermath of the music, those few drifting bars which came and went without source or conductor, the silence deepened, but not in any ordinary way. It became a thing unto itself, heavy and aware, as if the house had heard something it recognized. Miss Marple observed the expressions around her. Lady Anstruther had turned pale and closed her eyes for a brief moment longer than could be considered appropriate. Sebastian stood with his back unusually straight, jaw tight, though his gaze avoided the piano altogether. Mrs. Carmody was still seated, her hands clenched over her clutch bag. The others said nothing, not out of courtesy, but something closer to caution. No one offered an explanation. None was demanded. That evening, supper resumed with subdued conversation. The guests, it seemed, had accepted what they had heard without debate, an unsettling form of etiquette, which told Miss Marple much more than words ever could. These people had heard it before, when she later retired to her guest room, a second-floor suite overlooking the ballroom terrace. She opened the window out of habit. The air was still. Somewhere far below, the garden statues stood crooked among brambles, their stone faces half swallowed by moss and silence. But her gaze fell back to the ballroom wing, and to a peculiar detail. Though the interior light had long been extinguished, she could just make out movement, a flicker behind the sheer curtains, the unmistakable suggestion of someone swaying, not pacing, not walking, swaying. The rhythm was unmistakably that of a waltz. The next morning, breakfast was served by Elsie, who offered toast and tea with averted eyes and quick steps. She said little.
save for a single whispered phrase when refilling Miss Marple's cup. He said the music followed him home. That's what Dr. Cartwright said before he vanished. Vanished? Asked Miss Marple gently. Elsie nodded, then glanced sharply over her shoulder. 3 years ago, no one mentions it. He tuned the piano for Lady Anstruther's cousin, heard the tune 3 nights in a row, then walked into the orchard and left his coat behind. The girl said no more. Her hands were trembling. Miss Marple found herself once again seated beside Lady Anstruther later that afternoon, the 2 women in quiet conversation while the others scattered across the estate. The host's expression betrayed something unspoken, fatigue perhaps, or a reluctance to speak plainly, but she managed, after several minutes of silence, to produce a small leather-bound volume from her shawl, a diary, aged and unlabeled, bound with twine. My grandmother's, she said softly. She was the first to hold the ball here. There's an entry you ought to read. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly, stopping at the date in question, March 2nd, 8, in faded ink. The entry was brief. The waltz played before we began. Georgina heard it first, then the glass shattered. I told them it was just nerves, but I don't think that was the truth. He stopped breathing with a smile on his face. I have hidden the mask. No one must wear it again. There was no signature. Miss Marple studied Lady Anstruther closely. Have you ever found the mask? No, she said, but the ballroom was locked the next morning, and my mother made it clear that no event would be held there again, until now. And what prompted the change of heart? Sebastian, she said, almost too quickly. He believes in confronting family history. He's a modern man, and we needed the income, a small fee to attend, a weekend retreat. It's fashionable now to rent out old tragedies. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. It was later that same day when the other guests made their appearances once again. Major Beckwith, polishing his cane with a rag far too clean for outdoor use, nodded curtly at Miss Marple. He said little, though his eyes scanned her carefully, almost as if weighing her presence against an unseen list. Dr. Langley, pale as ever, had brought a journal with him, scribbling furiously during tea time, never once making eye contact. Mrs. Carmody said she remembered Miss Marple from somewhere, Cheltenham perhaps, or the ferry from Loo, and insisted they had shared a biscuit once during the Queen's Jubilee. But when asked what had brought her to Eversfield, her answer was vague. We were all invited, weren't we? Or maybe summoned. That word, summoned. It left an impression. Irene Vale was found once again at the piano, this time cleaning the keys with a white cloth and refusing conversation. When asked what she planned to perform during the masquerade, she offered only, nothing composed. The day passed quietly. The air remained still. No wind, no bird song. The grandfather clock in the main hall struck 6, then 9, then 10, each chime echoing too long across the walls, and then, once again, the ballroom. Miss Marple found herself drawn there not by curiosity, but by that faint tension one feels when approaching the edge of something. The curtains had been pulled open, the floorboards scrubbed, a long line of paper masks, ornate, old-fashioned. Some cracked, had been laid on a mahogany table by the doors. One of them, a silver one, was missing a ribbon. Another was stained at the edge with something dark, long since dried. She did not touch them. Instead, she stepped across the threshold. The piano sat, untouched. The keys were lowered. No player, no guest. Just the faint smell of wood polish, and something else, something sweet, yet old. Then the waltz began again, fainter this time, slower, as if being played not on keys, but remembered by something that once knew music well. Miss Marple did not move, she did not speak, she only listened, and as the sound faded into silence once more, she looked up and noticed something she had missed the night before. The portrait, above the fireplace, a couple in mid-step, paused mid-turn, a woman in crimson, a man in formal grey. The woman's feet, unlike the rest of the frame, were dustless, but it was the man that caught her eye. His face was no longer facing forward, it was turned toward the piano. The man in the portrait, his head now subtly turned toward the piano, had once gazed outward with the same genteel detachment as his painted companion, but now the very angle of his neck, that slight shift in posture, suggested a detail far more disturbing than paint should allow. Miss Marple, rarely a woman given to fancy, felt no desire to dismiss it as lighting. The brushwork itself remained identical, Only the gaze had shifted. It had not been repainted. It had simply adjusted. At supper that night, conversation was markedly thinner. The guests, while formally seated and appropriately dressed, had begun to exhibit quiet signs of unease. Cutlery placed slightly off-center, wine glasses filled and left untouched, bread rolls crumbled but uneaten. Lady Anstrue's voice trembled on occasion, though she carried on with the stoicism of a woman who had entertained foreign dignitaries, and worse. "Sebastian intends to hold a small rehearsal in the ballroom tomorrow," she said, as she passed the potatoes, her hand shaking ever so slightly. "Just a few steps to test the acoustics, a waltz perhaps, something simple." Miss Marple said nothing. Irene Vale, seated 2 places down, smiled faintly. "The floor has a memory," Irene murmured, her voice nearly too soft to hear. "Old wood listens. Every step, every turn, it remembers." Mrs. Carmody let out a brittle laugh. "I've always believed music leaves impressions, like thumbprints in the air." Major Beckwith coughed once, and then twice, as though the very notion caused discomfort. "Wood rots," he muttered, "that's all." And yet, none of them challenged the idea aloud. That night, Miss Marple wandered the corridor near the ballroom, eyes scanning the baseboards, the paintings, the doors that led nowhere. It was then she heard it, a faint thudding, like a rhythm pressed into the walls themselves. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again, as though someone were marking time with their heel. The pattern matched the waltz. She followed the sound, past the servants' quarters, down a narrow hall she had not previously noticed. At its end, an unlit alcove, and a door fitted with a tarnished brass knob. She reached for it, only to hear, just beyond it, a breath, nothing else. No voices, no footsteps, no whispering, just one breath. The door did not open. It did not need to. What had once been rhythm became silence once more. The next morning, she returned to the ballroom with Irene. "You heard it, didn't you?" Irene asked, her tone flat. "It always starts small, a bar, a phrase, then it waits. The music has intentions." "You're very familiar with a piano that's not supposed to have played for 25 years, Miss Marple observed calmly. Irene did not answer. She ran her hand across the lid, her fingers pausing over a scratch in the varnish, 3 sharp gouges, spaced evenly. "Not all damage is physical," Irene whispered. Miss Marple returned to her room shortly after. On her nightstand, she found a slip of paper folded into thirds. No handwriting, only a torn corner of a telegram, its typed message incomplete. "He never left the ballroom. Don't let them dance. The mask was never found." The note was unsigned. It was then, at precisely 5 minutes past 4, that the piano played again. This time the waltz came fully formed, 3 long bars, repeated, slow, deliberate, but still, no pianist. The guests rushed to the room, all save one. Dr. Langley had not appeared, and when the housekeeper was sent to retrieve him, she returned with a pale face, and one simple statement: "His room is empty." And yet, his shoes were still beneath the bed, his bag untouched, and on the dressing table, a single silver mask, the same mask missing from the ballroom display. Miss Marple entered the ballroom last. The chandelier swayed gently above her, though there was no breeze, and seated at the piano, back perfectly straight, hands motionless atop the keys, was no one at all, yet the music played, a single looping phrase, and in that moment, for the first time since her arrival, Jane Marple allowed herself to feel something uncharacteristic. Not fear, not yet, something closer to recognition. There was a pattern. She had seen it before, tragedy that mimicked repetition, a motive without confession, a vanished man, a locked room, a deception long disguised beneath civility. The tune drifted into silence, and Miss Marple whispered under her breath, "The dance has already begun. If you've stayed with us this far, you're clearly the sort of person who doesn't shy from a shadowed waltz, or a mystery laced with delicate suspicion. For more stories like this, do consider subscribing, not merely to keep pace, but to remain one step ahead."
Chapter 2. The Melody in the Mirror. The melody had ended, yet its impression lingered, like the faint scent of roses pressed between the pages of an unopened book. The ballroom stood quiet now, The piano untouched, the chandelier above returning to stillness as if nothing had moved. But something had. Of that Miss Marple was increasingly certain. And while no alarm was raised, no voice cried out, there was a perceptible shift in the behaviour of the house's guests, small, discreet, but unmistakable. Mrs. Carmody crossed herself when no one watched. Sebastian tapped his fingers in triple time against the base of his wine-glass. Even Lady Anstruther, who had weathered society's more ruthless winters with poise, appeared distracted, her speech faltering, her sentences ending sooner than they began. The matter of the music was publicly dismissed. A strange coincidence, an old floorboard settling, a draught through the organ pipes perhaps. Irene Vale, the pianist, insisted flatly, and with a touch too much composure, that the instrument had not been played, could not have been played, and most certainly was not being played at the time the sound had emerged. Miss Marple had watched her say it, listened carefully to the timbre of her voice and the cool precision with which she deflected, and noted with the same measured attention that while Irene had denied the music, she had never denied hearing it. That distinction, quiet though it was, did not escape her. The staff kept to their duties, but their eyes darted. The maid, Elsie, avoided the ballroom entirely, and when pressed gently by Miss Marple during breakfast, she offered only a name, spoken in a whisper. "Clara," she said, "the one who danced 25 years ago." And when asked what had happened to Clara, Elsie simply shook her head and whispered, "She never stopped." That night, the wind outside did not stir. No birds called from the trees, and the grandfather clock at the foot of the staircase skipped the 12 chimes altogether, as if hesitant to acknowledge midnight. Guests retired early, most without saying good night. The house held its breath. At precisely 3:04 a.m., according to the kitchen clock, one of the few mechanisms in the house that seemed immune to interference, Mrs. Carmody's door opened. She did not dress. She did not collect her shawl or slippers. She stepped quietly down the east hallway in her nightgown, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, eyes wide open and entirely unblinking. Her expression, to anyone who might have seen it, would have been one of serene expectation, not distress, not confusion. She descended the staircase with a grace entirely at odds with her age and gait. Her movements were rhythmic, fluid, entirely in time, and she walked directly to the ballroom. At dawn, her body was found standing in the centre of the ballroom floor, her posture rigid, one arm held aloft, as though awaiting the next beat of a dance left incomplete. Her eyes, still open, reflected the dim light of morning through the window panes. Her final breath had caught in her throat, and the faint scent of crushed roses and settled dust lingered in the air around her. No violence, no wound, no struggle. The doors had remained closed all night, locked in fact from the inside. Sebastian was the first to arrive, then Lady Anstruther, trembling with one gloved hand pressed to her cheek. Irene Vale said nothing at all. It was Miss Marple who stepped closer, eyes narrowing, not in horror but thought. The posture, the angle of the head, the stillness, all too familiar. "A curtsy," she murmured, mid-curtsy, and then a new silence fell, heavier than the last. By midday the guests had begun whispering, not in the open, not in the hallways, but in corners, behind library doors, over hasty cups of tea left half-finished. The word used most was not grief, nor shock, but curse. The Eversfield Waltz curse, one guest muttered, recalling the tragedy a quarter-century past. The woman who danced alone, the man who had vanished during rehearsal, the sheet music that had appeared on its own in the organ bench, unsigned, untitled, and incomplete. "There's always someone who hears it," Major Beckwith said to no one in particular, "and once they do, they can't unhear it." Miss Marple, seated in the breakfast room, turned a page in the estate diary Lady Anstruther had quietly allowed her to read. It was there, in neat copperplate, dated 1904, that a prior entry confirmed the existence of a similar incident, a guest who had danced through the night without stopping, until she collapsed, and upon waking, could no longer recall her name. Her face, too,
had remained fixed in a curtsy. The page that followed had been torn out. Elsie found Miss Marple in the hallway later that day, breathless, pale. She gripped the edge of the wallpaper and spoke in a voice barely audible. "There's something you need to see," she said. "It wasn't like that yesterday." She led her to the mirror, a narrow gold-framed glass mounted between the second-floor guest rooms, easily overlooked, until it wasn't. Miss Marple had passed it more than once, and noted its simple craftsmanship, its age, but now something had changed. Within the mirror's reflection, the hallway appeared as expected, but standing in the center of that reflected hallway, clearly, vividly, was a couple. A woman in crimson, a man in grey, dancing. There was no one there, in the real hallway. No figures, no motion, only the soft ticking of the kitchen clock below, and the distant echo of distant footsteps that never drew closer. Elsie stepped back, clutching her arm. "They're always there now," she whispered, "since the night the music played." Miss Marple stared into the glass, her voice calm. "Have you told anyone?" "No one would listen," the girl replied. "They said I imagined it. But the mirror, it doesn't lie." Miss Marple remained before the mirror for several long, deliberate seconds, her reflection steady, eyes narrowed, posture composed, but the wheels of her mind quietly shifting through the image. The couple danced on, smooth and looping, as though some hidden conductor urged them forward, bound to a rhythm no longer audible to human ears. Yet what struck her most was not the motion, nor the strangeness of their presence, but the precise timing. They moved in perfect alignment with the same 3-beat pattern of the waltz played 2 nights prior. 3 steps, turn. 3 steps, pause. Always in sequence, always in shadow. She leaned closer to the glass and saw it, a clue subtle but deliberate. The woman's mask, delicate and pearl-trimmed, had a mark near the temple, a faded rose-shaped blotch, darker than the surrounding silk. Miss Marple had seen that mask before. It had been laid out among the ballroom collection, the one no guest had selected. She remembered because it had been the only one already tied in a loose knot. She said nothing to Elsie, only nodded once and stepped away, her thoughts now gathering shape. Something about the rhythm of the past here was too consistent, too aligned. It was not merely coincidence, it was structure. Downstairs, Sebastian was in the library, pacing. His hand trembled as he set down his glass. Sherry, untouched, and reached for a telegram sealed inside an envelope. Miss Marple entered without knocking. He stiffened. "You found her," he said flatly. "Mrs. Carmody." "Yes," she replied, mid-curtsy. He swallowed. "I don't believe in curses, Miss Marple. I don't." His voice cracked, just slightly. "But the ballroom wasn't unlocked last night. I had the only key. I swear that to you." "And yet someone unlocked it," she replied. "Or something did." He turned the telegram toward her. "This came the day before you arrived, from someone named Alton West. Said he had news about the Eversfield score, called it cursed material, that he'd found the original signature, told me not to hold the ball. Did you respond?" "I wrote back," he nodded, "but I never posted it. I meant to. I forgot. And now," Miss Marple opened the telegram. The message was brief, jumbled, as though typed in haste. The melody repeats. "It's a trap, not a tune. Masked faces." The original version had a title, "Look Under the Floorboards." "Did you?" she asked calmly. "No," he said. "Frankly, I was afraid I might find it." She left him in the library, tapping a finger against the brass lamp as she exited. She passed Irene Vale in the hallway, who had her arms crossed and eyes fixed on a painting, one Miss Marple had not noticed before. A portrait of a child, faceless, the canvas worn away, the frame elaborate with dancing cherubs along its edge. Irene turned as she approached. "He asked me to play the music again," she said. "Sebastian?" "No," she replied, softly. "Someone else." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "I had a dream last night," Irene continued. "I was in the ballroom, and someone I couldn't see was standing at the piano. He had gloves on, white ones. He told me to finish the piece." "Did you?" Irene hesitated. "I tried, but I woke before I struck the final chord." "Dreams," Miss Marple said gently, "often contain fragments of things we've been taught to forget." That evening, while the others convened awkwardly in the parlor for card games none seemed eager to play, Miss Marple made her way back to the second-floor mirror. This time, she brought a candle, The reflection returned. The couple danced, but something was different. Their pace had slowed, their movements unbalanced. The man now seemed to be pulling the woman toward him, his hand clasping hers with a grip that looked more like constraint than affection. Her head tilted further, as though struggling to keep upright. Miss Marple raised the candle. The figures stopped. In the reflection, both turned their heads, not their bodies, only their heads toward her. In that moment, footsteps echoed behind her, but when she turned, the corridor was empty. Then came the sound, low, almost imperceptible, a chord, from the ballroom. One note, sustained. She descended the stairs quickly, entered the hall. The door to the ballroom had shut. She reached for the handle. It would not turn. Locked. And from the other side, though the room was empty, a faint laugh, soft, whispered, and unmistakably feminine. Miss Marple stood before the ballroom door, her hand still resting on the brass handle that no longer turned. The lock had engaged from the inside. Of that she was certain. The whisper of a laugh, a delicate dry sound like breath across lace, had come from within. Yet when she called out softly, with measured calm, "Is anyone there?" no voice returned. Only silence, thick and patient, settled on the other side. The hall behind her remained deserted. The house had entered its night hush, windows shuttered, lights dimmed, the very floorboards reluctant to creak beneath her weight. She stepped back and examined the seams of the door. There were no scratches, no signs of tampering, nothing to suggest this was part of some common trick or juvenile performance. She waited. 3 minutes, perhaps 4. Then, just as quietly as it had locked, the door unlatched with a click, neither loud nor abrupt but decisive, the kind of click that speaks not of rusted metal or loose hinges, but of intention. She opened it slowly. The ballroom was empty. The piano lid remained closed, the keys untouched. The chandelier no longer swayed. There were no footprints on the recently waxed floor, and yet something new had appeared. A set of gloves, white, formal, and folded, had been placed on the piano bench. Miss Marple approached them with quiet steps. They were warm to the touch. On the bench beneath them, a sliver of aged parchment protruded from the seam. She drew it out gently. It was a single bar of music, handwritten, fluid, unfinished. The ink was fresh. She examined the clef, the notations, the signature space left blank, and then she looked again, closer. A symbol had been scratched faintly at the bottom corner, a rose, drawn in 3 strokes, identical to the mark on the woman's mask in the mirror. She folded the parchment into her handbag and left the room. The next morning, breakfast was delayed. The staff could not locate Mrs. Carmody's belongings. Her room had been cleared. No suitcase, no handbag, no hat. Only the bed remained made, as though no one had ever slept in it. When Lady Anstruther demanded an explanation, the housekeeper merely shook her head and insisted no room by that name had been occupied. Miss Marple did not argue. Instead, she walked once more to the second-floor mirror. The couple was no longer dancing. They stood still, facing one another. The man's mask now bore a crack across one cheek. The woman's hand was raised toward his throat. Miss Marple's reflection appeared between them, silent, watching. She turned away, only when Elsie approached with another whisper. "I saw it last night," the maid said, voice thin. "A door where there shouldn't be one, behind the library shelves. When, just before the music started again, I heard footsteps. I thought it was Dr. Langley, but when I followed, there was no one, only a door. It was gone this morning." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A door that appears, then vanishes. That, my dear, is an invitation, and invitations always mean someone is expecting us." That afternoon, Irene Vale returned to the piano. She sat without playing, her fingers poised over the keys, her eyes closed, not in concentration, but in recollection. Miss Marple observed from the doorway. "What is it about this piece?" she asked. "It isn't a piece," Irene replied without looking up. "It's a memory, one we've all heard before, whether we remember or not. You speak as though it chose you. It chooses everyone eventually. You'll see." And with that she pressed a single key. A note rang out, clear, sharp and solitary. The chandelier flickered, and somewhere in the distance, a mirror cracked.
Chapter 3. Steps in the Dust. It is often said that houses, like people, possess memory, layers of recollection that linger beneath their surfaces. rarely visible to the eye, but always present, shaping the way floorboards groan, how staircases hesitate, how shadows stretch where they should not. At Eversfield Hall, memory was more than a sentiment. It was structural, woven into each beam and sill, like the faded notes of a melody etched into the walls. The morning after Irene struck that solitary key, the house responded, not with noise, not with voices, but with marks. In the ballroom, so recently polished, cleared, restored, dust had returned overnight, not in clumps or neglectful corners, but in deliberate form, footprints, soft and symmetrical, arranged in looping circles across the floor, each pair perfectly spaced, as though some absent couple had danced through the hours while the household slept. No one confessed to entering. No one admitted possession of shoes narrow enough, light enough, smooth enough to leave that pattern. There was no breeze. The windows had not been opened. The door had been locked, and yet the steps were unmistakable. They were not human, exactly, but they were familiar. Miss Marple arrived just after 7 o'clock, invited by Elsie, who had found them while placing linen on the windowsill. The girl was pale. Her hands did not stop shaking. "They move every morning," she whispered. "I clean them. The next day they're back." Miss Marple crouched beside one of the arcs, her gloved finger tracing the outer edge of a turn. "Triple time," she murmured. "Left foot leads, 3 steps before each pivot." And then, almost without thinking, she followed the pattern. Slowly. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Her shoes marked nothing in the dust. Hers was too recent, too real. But the original prints remained untouched, as if set not by weight, but intention. Later that day she found Sebastian in the music room, leaning against the mantelpiece, his collar open, his face a shade paler than before. "You saw the footprints," he said before she could speak. "Yes, they've always been there, in some form, not always visible, but always waiting. My mother used to say the house was remembering. That was her word for it, as though the floor had its own recollection of the dance." "And you believe that?" Miss Marple asked gently. He hesitated, then sighed. "I don't know what I believe anymore. I was 6 when I first heard it. The tune. I followed it to the ballroom. My nanny found me spinning in circles, laughing, calling it the floating music. I didn't remember it the next day, but I've never forgotten that feeling." "Have you heard it recently?" He nodded once. "Last night, twice, the same phrase, fainter than before, but real." She studied him, then asked, "And Dr. Langley?" Sebastian looked up. "Gone. Gone. He left before sunrise, according to the porter. Left no note, took nothing with him." "That would be unusual," she said. "Langley was a rationalist, obsessed with the mind. He'd been recording phonograph samples of ambient noise in the ballroom to debunk the melody. Said if he could prove it was a resonance or echo chamber phenomenon, the rest would fall into place. He had dinner with us, went back to his room, and now he's vanished. And the staff claim he walked out through the service door, but there are no footprints outside, just frost." That evening, while others prepared for supper, Miss Marple slipped into the ballroom once more, this time alone. The air was still, the chandelier unlit. She made her way to the far wall, behind the organ, where faint scratches marked the floor. There, hidden behind the lowest row of pipes, she found something crumpled, half tucked, half stuffed, as though it had been hidden in haste. A coat. Dr. Langley's coat, torn at the sleeve, the inside pocket turned out, a shred of phonograph tape still attached to a clasp. She held it for a moment. The lining smelled faintly of varnish, and something older, paper perhaps, or dust. There was no note, no explanation, just absence. Miss Marple stood for some time with the coat in hand, not as one puzzled by a simple loss, but as one weighing the implications of absence. In her long career observing human behaviour, its habits, frailties, deceptions, she had rarely found anything so suspicious as silence paired with convenience. Dr. Langley had allegedly departed without a single item from his luggage, without a word, without his coat on a bitter morning, and without, as she now confirmed, his phonograph reels, which had vanished from their satchel altogether. There had been in her life many vanishing acts, men with double lives, women with forged names, heirs who preferred mystery to inheritance, but none had ever folded so cleanly, so quietly, without even a whisper of inconvenience to those left behind. Which is what made this so very troubling. When she emerged from the ballroom, coat folded beneath her arm, Irene was waiting. She stood in the corridor like a statue temporarily reanimated, her hands clasped behind her back, her expression composed yet distant, the way one watches from a balcony above a stage, not quite part of the action yet intimately familiar with the scene. "Is that his?" Irene asked, nodding to the coat. "It is. They'll say he left," she said, voice too even. "They always do. You speak as if this has happened before." Irene tilted her head. "Houses like this don't forget, and people like Dr. Langley are rarely missed by the right ones." "And which are the right ones?" Irene only smiled. That evening's supper was sombre. Mrs. Carmody's absence remained unspoken. Dr. Langley's perfunctorily excused. Major Beckwith speculated vaguely about telegrams and unexpected obligations. Lady Anstruther stirred her consommé without lifting her spoon. Sebastian remained fixed in thought, eyes staring not at the table but beyond it, toward the doors to the ballroom, and Irene, still poised, still perfectly polite, ate nothing. Miss Marple took her tea later in the library alone save for Elsie, who arrived bearing a tray with shaking hands. "Miss," she whispered, "I saw her. Last night." "Whom?" "Miss Vale. She was in the ballroom, in the dark, no candles. Just dancing. Alone." "How did you know she was dancing?" "Her steps," Elsie breathed. "They matched the music, but there wasn't any music. Not any you could hear," Miss Marple said quietly. The following morning, more footprints had appeared in the dust, this time in pairs, one set larger than the other, circling close, impossibly close, the toe of one foot nearly overlapping the heel of the other. The pattern told a story. Pursuit, resistance, a reversal in motion. Miss Marple followed the path with her eyes, then her feet, one slow step at a time. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Pause. The steps stopped at the piano. Both sets. She lifted the lid, and there, wedged between two black keys, folded with meticulous care, and nearly indistinguishable from the instrument's dark finish, was a torn sheet of manuscript paper. She unfolded it with gloved hands. "The Widow's Dance," it read, dated 1824. The ink, still gleaming faintly, had not dried longer than a day, and in the bottom corner, beneath the clef, no composer's name, just a signature, marked with an ornate initial. Miss Marple stared at the signature for a long moment, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was entirely too specific in its ambiguity. The letter V alone was nothing, but its flourish, the manner in which the tail dipped elegantly below the line before twisting upward again, recalled a style once popular in the mid-19th century, most often associated with personal signatures, not formal compositions. She knew it well. She had seen it in old letters from the continent, from a woman who had once fled an affair in Vienna, a woman who, rumour had it, never stopped writing music, but never published a note under her true name. And now it surfaced here. She folded the manuscript carefully, concealed it beneath the lining of her handbag, and returned the piano lid to its closed position with a delicacy befitting a tomb. Upstairs, the hallways were unusually quiet. The gas lamps had been dimmed, earlier than usual, and the grandfather clock at the base of the stairwell had once again refused to strike the hour. It stood there, majestic, resolute, unwilling to keep time. She passed the second-floor mirror only briefly this time. The dancing couple had vanished from its surface, replaced not by empty space, but by a smear, a long diagonal blur, as though someone had tried to scrub their image away with a gloved hand. The smear ran downward, stopping just above the base of the glass, and there, faintly, where a chin might rest in contemplation, was the faint trace of a fingerprint. When she entered the drawing-room, Sebastian stood alone before the fireplace, clutching a glass of port that he neither drank nor discarded. He turned when she stepped in, his expression drawn and sleepless.
You know it now, don't you? He asked. The name, on the manuscript. I know a letter, Miss Marple replied. Letters are not names, but they lead to names. Always. She said nothing. He stepped closer, lowered his voice. You think I brought it here? I didn't. Did you invite her? She asked calmly. Irene. No, she said. The widow. He exhaled sharply, turned his face away, and dropped into a chair as though the weight of the question had rendered him briefly mortal. I don't know, he said finally. I don't think anyone does, but if she is here, she's been here a very long time. Outside, the sky darkened prematurely, clouds folding in on the horizon like parchment scorched at the edge. Somewhere on the second floor, a door clicked shut, though no one had ascended the stairs. Irene was seen once, near the stairwell, murmuring something under her breath, her steps precise, turning slowly, arms half raised. She did not acknowledge the others. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the library alone. She sat by the fire, unlit, her hands folded on her lap. From her handbag, she withdrew the music sheet. She read it again. The Widow's Dance. The bars cut off midway through the fifth measure. The ink, though fresh, smudged slightly near the margin, as if the hand that wrote it had trembled at the end. She turned it over. A second fragment had been attached beneath the corner fold. A note, handwritten in English, but with a sharp foreign rhythm. Do not let the waltz reach its final bar. If it ends, it begins again. And below that, in smaller script, we danced once. The door to the library shut behind her. She turned. No one stood there. No footsteps on the carpet. Only a single white glove now resting on the floor. It had not been there before.
Chapter 4. The Hidden Room. The glove had not fallen, nor been dropped. That much was evident to Miss Marple, who now stood quietly before it, the fireless hearth at her back, the manuscript still folded within her bag. The glove was placed, not cast, its fingers curved slightly inward, resting not in disorder, but in a poised half gesture, as though the hand inside had once prepared to lift a mask. She leaned forward, picked it up carefully. It was warm. She did not cry out. That was not her nature, but the rhythm of her thoughts began to change. A woman of practiced restraint, she had long known the difference between superstition and strategy, between tales meant to unsettle and those meant to warn. And now, more than at any point since her arrival, she felt the hall tightening around its secrets. Later that evening, as the house withdrew into the hush of gaslight and footfalls, she returned once again to the west corridor, where Lady Anstruther's room stood beyond the locked panelled doors. She knocked only once, and was admitted at once. "You've read the manuscript," the older woman said without preamble. "I have," replied Miss Marple, "but it's the name I haven't yet seen that interests me most." Lady Anstruther sat before the vanity, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes, framed by age and fatigue, stared not at her guest but at the reflection, though the mirror showed her nothing but herself. "There are things I have not shared," she began, "not to be deceitful, but because I feared they might be misused. You must understand, Miss Marple, that my family has always been touched by tragedy, and the ballroom, well, that room carries more than history, it carries obligation." "Obligation? My grandmother's journal," she said. "You'll find it in the lower drawer of that escritoire. It's bound in dark green leather. Look for the page marked with a dried violet." Miss Marple opened the drawer, retrieved the book, and turned carefully through the pages until she found it. December 6th, 19... A long passage, written in a trembling hand. The ink had faded at the edges, but the meaning remained intact. Tonight, Genevieve led her third séance. She claimed the spirits spoke through the music, that they required movement to be heard. I was sceptical until the 4th minute, when the chandelier dimmed and Evangeline stood up from her chair, face blank, arms lifted. She waltzed in silence for 4 turns. When we reached her, she had clawed her own palms raw. The music had not played, but she heard it. I fear we all did. We should never have invoked the widow. Miss Marple closed the journal without comment. "Genevieve," she said after a pause, "was the housekeeper?" "Yes, and something more. She arrived in 1898, claiming descent from a Parisian pianist who had written for salons and royal patrons. She had a charm about her, quiet but commanding. She never sought employment, she was invited. By whom, no one could recall. And the séances, private affairs, conducted only when the moon was waning. She believed that the house, when filled with music, allowed something to pass through, like lifting the lid of a box and allowing something ancient to breathe. And the woman, Evangeline, she was never the same, Lady Anstruther said, her voice thinning. She wandered for days, humming a tune none of us could identify. She vanished the night after the fourth session. There it was again, vanished, the pattern continuing. And the architect, Miss Marple asked, the man who designed the ballroom. Lady Anstruther hesitated. I've only fragments. He was Italian, or perhaps Corsican. He called the design a circular resonance chamber. My grandfather said he grew obsessed with symmetry, insisted the measurements must mirror the golden ratio precisely. He spoke of dancers buried in blueprint. I beg your pardon. Those were his words. He claimed he had sealed the echo of movement into the walls that once completed, the ballroom would remember every step, and what became of him. He threw himself into the foundation well before the floor was laid. They say he cursed the final layer. Miss Marple said nothing. She looked once more to the mirror, where Lady Anstruther's reflection sat stiff and alone. The ballroom, she said, has a second door, one not listed in the blueprints. Yes, the lady replied, behind the fireplace, but it hasn't been opened in decades. I believe it's time, said Miss Marple quietly, that we opened it now. The ballroom was empty when they entered, its lamps left unlit at Miss Marple's request, allowing only the natural gloom of the overcast morning to filter in through the tall, shrouded windows. Lady Anstruther moved slowly, her hands gloved and trembling, carrying with her a small brass key on a faded ribbon. Miss Marple carried no lantern, no torch, only a box of matches and an old iron candle holder she had borrowed from the library, its stub of wax nearly spent. The fireplace loomed in silence, carved from black marble, flanked by twisted cherubs with vacant expressions and blank instruments. It had stood untouched for nearly half a century, sealed on its left flank by a single brass plate, flat, featureless, set flush into the stone. It was to this plate that Lady Anstruther moved, inserting the key with practiced care, as though recalling an action committed only once, long ago. The plate clicked, faintly, and slid inward, revealing a narrow seam in the wall. A second push, and the stone gave way, groaning slightly as it revealed a hidden door, low and arched, lined with aged wood and iron braces that had rusted into the grain. Neither woman spoke. Miss Marple stepped forward, lifted the latch and pulled. The scent met them first. Not rot, not decay, but oldness. Paper, cloth, smoke, and something once fragrant, long faded. A staircase descended steeply into the dark, carved from stone, barely wide enough for 2 feet across. They began the descent slowly, Miss Marple leading, her candle flickering with each step, casting stretched shadows that danced across the walls in time with their breath. At the base, a door, iron-banded, locked not with a key, but with a hook latch, inside facing. Someone, at some point, had locked this room from within. Miss Marple raised her hand, hesitated, then pressed it open. What greeted them was not horror, but stillness, so complete that it felt almost staged. A room the size of a drawing chamber, lined with tattered velvet curtains, now grey with age. Dust blanketed every inch of floor and furniture, and in the centre stood 3 mannequins, no longer upright, slumped as though frozen mid-rehearsal. 2 bore full Victorian gowns, crumbling at the hem, stained at the shoulders. 1 wore a tailcoat and gloves, 1 glove missing. Their faces had been fitted with porcelain masks, doll-like, their features painted into a delicate mockery of joy. But it was the back wall that caught Miss Marple's attention. There, mounted in perfect symmetry, hung a set of framed photographs, sepia, glass-covered, each marked in handwritten ink, ballroom rehearsal, spring 1902. Lady Anstruther's grandmother among them, the architect, and to the far right, a woman in crimson, maskless, Irene, the features unmistakable, the posture identical, no ambiguity in the line of the jaw,
the slant of the brows, or the slight lift of the chin. "My God," whispered Lady Anstruther, "but that's impossible." Miss Marple said nothing. She stepped forward, lifted the candle, and studied the photograph more closely. "She hasn't aged," Lady Anstruther whispered. "That cannot be." "Then the question becomes," Miss Marple murmured, "whether we are misled, or she is unchanged." On a table beneath the photographs lay an open ledger, its spine cracked, pages delicate, every line inscribed with names, dates, titles, waltzes, polkas, and a single entry repeated 3 times. Widow's Dance, revised, performer G. The name was always abbreviated, only the initial remained. Next to the ledger sat a glass dome. Inside, a single dried rose. Beneath it, folded carefully, was a telegram. Miss Marple lifted the dome, unfolded the paper. "If the music completes, the house will remember too much. It must never be finished. She cannot stop it. I tried. No signature, just a smear where one might have been." Miss Marple placed the telegram down with deliberate care, her eyes not leaving the words, but her attention clearly elsewhere. There was something about the phrasing, "the house will remember too much," that stuck in her mind, not as metaphor, but as warning. She had learned, over many years, that certain phrases, when repeated across decades and by unrelated mouths, carry more weight than superstition. They signal design. Lady Anstruther stood silently beside her, breath shallow, hand resting on the back of the nearest mannequin, as though its fragile frame might steady her own. The air in the room had grown heavier, not from dust alone, but from proximity to intention, as though every item here had not merely been hidden, but arranged with purpose for discovery. Miss Marple turned toward the velvet curtain near the far corner of the room, and pulled it back. Behind it, a second fireplace, long bricked over. But above the mantel, affixed with rusted wire, hung another photograph, larger than the others, darkened by age and smoke. It depicted a children's party, dated faintly at the bottom, Eversfield Estate, summer, 1913. She brought the candle closer. The image was crowded, cheerful, nearly overexposed, yet her eye was drawn not to the foreground, but to the blurred background, near the trellis where ivy had long overtaken the stone. A girl stood there, young, upright, hands clasped before her, her face turned just enough to catch the light. And there, unmistakably, once again, Irene. No age, no variation, the same. She had been present in the photo taken in 1902. She had been present again in 1913. And now she sat in the present-day drawing room, sipping tea, her gaze distant, her posture unbent by time. Lady Anstruther gasped softly. "It can't be her," she whispered. "It's impossible. That was more than a century ago." "Or," Miss Marple said softly, "it's not impossible at all if she was never meant to leave." They turned together as a noise echoed faintly above them, furniture moved, or a drawer slid sharply shut. The sound was distant, but unmistakably from the ballroom above. "We are not alone in the house," Miss Marple said. "No," Lady Anstruther agreed, "but we never have been." They extinguished the candle, closed the ledger, and left the hidden chamber in silence, sealing the door behind them. Neither spoke as they stepped back into the main ballroom. The fireplace resealed itself with a click, as though content to have shared its truths. And yet, just before Miss Marple reached the exit, she turned, just once, and glanced toward the piano. The lid was open. It had been closed when they descended. Upon its black keys, a single object had been placed with perfect symmetry, a doll-sized mask, painted porcelain, mouth shaped into a frozen smile. Miss Marple stared. Then she reached into her handbag, drew out the old photograph from the hidden room, the one from 1902, and looked once more. There it was again, in the hand of the masked woman, barely visible unless one knew where to look. The same doll-sized mask, held not in play, but in offering, and standing behind her, face in profile, was another woman, unmasked. Miss Marple brought the photograph closer to the light. The features were just visible now. Young, blonde, sharp-eyed, a child, Lady Anstruther, but the woman in front of her, the one with the mask, was Irene, as she looks today.
Chapter 5. The Waltzing Widow. There are revelations that unfold like paper, gradual, neat, logical, and then there are those that land without ceremony, immediate in their discomfort, like a face one recognizes in a crowd but cannot place, not because the memory has failed, but because it has been quietly corrected by time itself. When Miss Marple stood in the library that night, the doll-sized mask resting on the piano and the photograph in her hand, the symmetry between past and present became for the first time undeniable. Irene had been here. Not once, not briefly, but again and again and again, and never altered. Some truths arrive not with explanation, but with presence. Her footsteps no longer made sound when she entered a room. Her eyes no longer blinked in thought, only in rhythm. Her responses were never inappropriate, never uncertain, always aligned with what others expected her to say. That, Miss Marple now realized, was its own form of deception. She sought Irene that morning with a calm curiosity, not confrontational but surgical, and found her in the drawing room, seated precisely at the edge of the chaise, as though she had rehearsed it. She wore grey, an elegant, subdued fabric that might have suited any year from 1910 to the present, and her hands were folded neatly in her lap. "I see you found the old music," Irene said, before Miss Marple could speak. "You know I have," came the reply. "Then I suppose there's no point denying it," Irene said with a faint smile. "The music came to this house long before I did, but Irene tilted her head slightly, like a dancer awaiting a signal. "I'm descended from Genevieve. That's the name written in the family journal, is it not?" "It is. Then I suppose I'm telling the truth." "Suppose you are," Miss Marple said. "Then tell me what the music wants." Irene's expression did not change. "The music doesn't want. It chooses. It calls to certain ears. Those who can hear it, they never forget. Once you hear the melody, it remains, in your bones, in your balance, in your breath, and once you've heard it, you dance," Irene whispered. "You don't always know you're doing it. Not at first, a step here, a turn there, but it builds, and when the dance completes, you belong to it, forever." "That depends," she replied softly. "Some complete the steps and vanish, some remain, and some stay too long in the middle." The words left a taste in the air, a suggestion of something unfinished. Later that evening, Major Beckwith was found standing at the foot of the staircase, eyes closed, mouthing something without sound. He did not stir when spoken to, but his fingers tapped, slowly, against the railing. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Miss Marple asked what he was counting. "She's at the 7th bar," he muttered. "She never misses." "Who?" "The one in the mirror," he said, then turned away. "You didn't see her? When?" "Just now, dancing. That same hour. Elsie could not be found. Her bed had been made, her apron folded, her shoes placed neatly by the window, but she was gone. No note, no sound, only her name, whispered once by Sebastian as he descended the east wing steps. She heard it yesterday, I know she did. No one answered him. That night, flickers returned to the mirrors, no longer constant, no longer clear, but present. 2 figures, sometimes 3, gliding just behind the reflections. Once, Lady Anstruther turned away too quickly and gasped aloud. When asked what she saw, she would not say. Irene remained calm. Always Irene remained calm. At dusk, Miss Marple returned to her room and found a note slipped beneath the door. The paper was yellowed, the edges torn, the handwriting was unfamiliar. "Play the full waltz," it read, "and the dance ends, or begins." No signature, only the outline of a rose, drawn in faded ink, barely visible, as though done in haste with a trembling hand. Miss Marple read the note twice, once for its meaning, and once for its timing. Words such as ends and begins often arrive too close together when matters of ritual and memory are involved, and this note was no exception. She held the paper near the candle on her desk, studying not the message, but the way it had been folded once vertically, then twice along the edge, precisely the way telegrams had once been tucked into military uniform pockets. The ink at the corner, shaped into a rose, had begun to blur, not from moisture but age. This paper had not been written on yesterday. It had waited.
Miss Marple folded it and placed it beside the torn waltz sheet retrieved from the piano days before. Together, they no longer felt like separate warnings. They felt sequential, 2 bars in a larger score yet unfinished. At breakfast, the house sat under an uneasy hush. Beckwith did not appear. Lady Anstruther, when asked, simply said, "He's resting," though she did not look up from her teacup. Irene arrived halfway through the meal, calm as ever, dressed in morning grey again, her brooch in the shape of a lyre. "The staff," she said softly, "are concerned. Elsie was well liked. I believe she heard the melody," Miss Marple replied, not as a question. Irene smiled, gracefully, with restraint. "That's possible. The waltz is quite generous with its invitations." "And what of those who don't dance? They're usually watching," she replied. Miss Marple rose from the table without another word. By mid-afternoon, the mirrors across the house began to behave unusually. In the guest corridor, one showed only the hallway, empty, even when Miss Marple stood directly before it. Another, outside the ballroom, flickered once as she passed, revealing for less than a second the unmistakable image of Elsie, facing away, one hand lifted as though caught in the middle of a curtsy. When Miss Marple turned back, the reflection was gone. She entered the ballroom again just after dusk. It was empty. The chandelier had been cleaned. She noted this at once, though no one had reported doing so. It now caught the lamplight in finer detail, reflecting tiny crescents across the floor. The piano sat closed, on the lid, a folded page of sheet music. Miss Marple approached it with care. The title had been written in a slanted hand, "Final Hour, Revision in G minor." Beneath the title, a cryptic inscription, "She cannot stop what she didn't begin, but she can finish what has always waited." She read it twice, then lifted the lid of the piano. The keys, though untouched, bore fresh dust, except for 3 in the center. They were spotless. She did not play. She left the room and returned to the hidden ledger she had found beneath the ballroom days earlier. There, alongside the entry for the widow's dance, now appeared a final annotation, one she had not seen before. It read simply, "5th performance, initiated, performer confirmed," and beside the word confirmed, a name had been scratched in, Irene Vale. Miss Marple closed the ledger with deliberate care, setting it back beneath the half-broken cabinet where she had first discovered it. There was no need to conceal it. Those who knew what it held had already read it, and those who had not would never find it, not in time. The house was already changing its tempo. Even its silence now had a rhythm. It wasn't simply that the rooms were quiet. It was that the silence itself paused, then resumed, as if something just outside hearing were conducting the air. She returned to the corridor, passing again the mirror by the ballroom door. This time she did not pause. The figures in its reflection were already waiting, arms lifted, heads turned slightly toward her, in greeting or invitation. One step more, and she would see their faces. But she did not look. Back in her room, she found the window cracked, though she herself had not opened it. On the sill sat a single music note, penned on the reverse side of a telegram stub. It contained only one word, play. She slept, if sleep can be used to describe the motionless hour she spent seated in her chair, hands folded in her lap, breath shallow, ears listening for a melody that never fully began. In the early grey light of morning a sound stirred, the piano. It began faintly, one note, then another, a pause, a chord, then the unmistakable first bars of the widow's dance, measured, careful, repeating in elegant sequence from beginning to end. No hesitation, no skips, no broken keys. She dressed quickly, entered the hall. No one else was awake. The mirror was blank again. The staircase was empty. She opened the ballroom door. The piano played on, alone. There was no one at the bench. The keys moved slowly, softly depressed, yet with no visible force behind them. The sound filled the room, not with noise but with structure, as though the house itself had drawn breath and remembered the exact position of every finger. The chandelier swayed gently, not from breeze but in rhythm. Then Miss Marple noticed something else. The fireplace door, sealed for decades, reopened days before, now stood ajar again. She stepped toward it, slowly, with caution but no hesitation, down the stairwell, into the hidden chamber, and stopped. The mannequins were gone. The costumes, the masks, the table, the ledger, all vanished. The dust had settled in unbroken film across the stone floor, but there, at the center, lay 3 distinct impressions in the dust. Footprints, tightly spaced, turned inward, in the middle of a waltz. One set, larger, one set, smaller, and one set, bare. She turned toward the wall, where the photographs had once hung. Now there remained only a single frame, crooked, cracked. Inside it, a newly placed image, a black and white photograph, faded but fresh, showing the ballroom from above. All the guests gathered, Sebastian, Beckwith, Anstruther, even Miss Marple herself at the edge of the crowd, and at the center of the ballroom, Irene facing the piano, a figure beside her, wearing a mask. The image was dated, yesterday.
Chapter 6. The Deadly Dance. It began with the rustling of silk. The masquerade, long anticipated, long delayed, was no longer a matter of invitation. It was an obligation. Eversfield Hall, always eager to remember, had now found its memory fully restored. In every corridor, candles had been lit not by the staff, but by some unspoken schedule. Light bloomed in rooms that had not been used in decades, and costumes pulled from trunks and wardrobes now hung from door frames as if their wearers had only stepped away. By twilight, every guest was adorned in attire far older than themselves. High collars, trailing sleeves, embroidered masks. One could not walk the length of the upper landing without passing a figure entirely unidentifiable, silent, faceless, yet somehow familiar. Miss Marple, though cautious, had chosen to wear the same gown she had worn to her niece's wedding. Modest, dignified, without embellishment. It made her conspicuous in a room of illusion, but perhaps that was the point. In the ballroom, the chandelier gleamed anew, each crystal reflecting dozens of tiny figures. The piano had been moved forward slightly, its bench velveted in red. The mirrors had been polished to such precision they no longer reflected, they repeated, as if each movement were an echo, slightly behind. Irene stood at the center of it all, dressed in jet black silk, her mask feathered, though her eyes were visible, fixed, unmoving, brighter than any light in the room. Pinned to her shoulder was a brooch, small, gilt, a lyre entwined with thorns. Miss Marple had seen it before. She had touched its duplicate in the sealed room days ago. It had not been on Irene's dress then. No one remembered the music beginning. There was no cue, no conductor, no signal. Yet it played, a waltz, familiar but changed, slower this time, more deliberate. Every bar paused for breath, every note drew attention to the space between. One by one the guests began to move. Irene extended her arm, and Sebastian took it. Their feet began to circle in a perfect arc, the crowd parting, the music directing their rhythm. Then Lady Anstruther rose from her chair without help and stepped into the dance. Major Beckwith followed. Miss Marple stood near the rear wall, her gaze fixed not on the dancers but on the ceiling, for the chandelier had begun to sway, though the air remained still. And then it happened. One guest, masked in white, their steps slightly slower, paused mid-turn and stumbled. Their arm went slack, their hand curled against their waist. No one noticed. The music covered it. The motion continued. Their knees buckled, and then collapse. A sudden exhalation through the crowd. Silence, but not total. The piano played on. Miss Marple crossed the floor, knelt beside the fallen guest. She did not remove the mask. There was no need. The expression had already changed. The eyes were wide, the lips parted. A faint smell rose from their skin, roses and dust. Someone whispered, "It's happening again." Another voice, nearer, murmured, "They weren't meant to dance." Miss Marple turned her gaze back to the piano and found Irene already seated at the bench, though no one had seen her move. Her fingers rested above the keys, but did not touch them, yet the melody continued. Sebastian now turned alone, caught mid-spin, and then he began to rise, not leap, not lift, rise, slowly, impossibly, his feet no longer on the floor, his body arched backward, hands stretched wide, and from his mouth, a sound, not a cry, not a scream, something more like A note held too long by a bow across strings, the sound coming from Sebastian's throat, held the room in a kind of paralysis. It was neither pain nor harmony, it lacked the urgency of one and the comfort of the other. Instead, it droned as a third part in the waltz, a dissonant companion to the piano's flawless tempo and the rustling of antique fabric against polished floor. Irene remained seated, fingers still poised, face tilted upward. She did not appear disturbed. In fact, there was something altogether too serene about her composure, like someone watching the final act of a familiar performance unfold, exactly as written. Miss Marple made her way forward. The other guests had backed away. Beckwith stood with his hand at his mouth, trembling. Lady Anstruther, unsteady, clutched the edge of a side table and whispered, over and over, "It wasn't supposed to be this way." No one moved toward Sebastian, not out of fear, but confusion. No one quite believed what they were seeing, except Miss Marple, because Miss Marple, from the moment the music began, had been watching the mirrors, and in the glass across from the piano, she had noticed something no one else had. There were more dancers reflected than were present in the room. A figure passed behind Irene, masked in lace and faceless in the real ballroom, but clear and vivid in the reflection. Another moved alongside Major Beckwith, a woman in mourning black, who had not been invited, whose image flickered and repeated with each step, as if looping through a memory too old to hold its shape. Irene turned her head slightly then, not toward Miss Marple, but toward the chandelier. A signal. Sebastian dropped, abrupt, final, as though a string had been cut. He lay curled against the ballroom tiles, shivering, eyes unfocused, lips still moving, but no longer making sound, just breathing, shallow, quick. Miss Marple kneeled beside him, checked his pulse. It was present, if irregular. His pupils contracted only slightly in the candlelight. He muttered something, one word, architect. She rose, eyes now on Irene. "Miss Vale," she said clearly, voice steady, "you wear a brooch that does not belong to you." Irene's fingers drifted toward it gently. "It belonged to my great-grandmother," she said. "Genevieve. She wore it when she held the first séance in this room. It was the seal of her gift." "Then explain," Miss Marple said softly, "how the same brooch was found with bones beneath this floor, and why your face appears unchanged in a photograph taken over 60 years ago." A pause. The guests, still dazed, turned slowly. Irene smiled, slightly. "Memory is a strange companion," she replied. "It follows us further than time ever does." Miss Marple did not respond. She stepped backward, toward the piano, then reached up and pressed the lid shut. The music did not stop. Irene had not moved. And then at last the chandelier stilled. The mirrors quieted, and something on the wall shifted. It was subtle at first, a dull glint where none had been, a flicker in the portrait above the fireplace. The painting had always depicted dancers, Victorian in style, mid-waltz, painted in oils, faded with time. But now Irene stood among them, masked, hand in hand with another figure, Dr. Langley, his coat, the same she had seen torn and discarded near the organ pipes, and his eyes open, looking directly at her. For several seconds, perhaps minutes, no one moved. It was not fear that held them, but recognition, not of something seen, but of something half-remembered, a melody heard once in childhood and forgotten, until now. The portrait above the hearth had changed its composition, not through paint or brushstroke, but by the slow, calculated permission of the house itself. Faces had repositioned, hands once joined to shadowed partners, now clasped known ones. And at the center, where before there had been only two dancers blurred in motion, now stood Irene, her face unmistakable, ageless, suspended in a moment of serene control, and beside her, Dr. Langley, no longer absent, no longer lost. Miss Marple turned toward Lady Anstruther, who had slumped into a high-backed chair, as if folded by memory. "You recognized her the moment she arrived, didn't you?" Marple asked softly. "You've seen that face before, in another season, under another name, perhaps when you were a girl and she a governess, or a nurse to your brother, or your mother." Lady Anstruther said nothing. Irene rose from the piano bench. No rustle, no hesitation.
"You cannot stop the dance, Miss Marple," she said quietly. "You can pause it, you can question it, you can stand at the edge and refuse the invitation, but eventually, even silence begins to move." Miss Marple stepped forward. "And what of Dr. Langley? What of Elsie? Where are they now?" Irene looked at her, not with menace, but with a calm born of absolute certainty. "Everyone returns to the music in their own time," she said, "some earlier than others." And then, with no more ceremony than one might give a closing door, she walked to the edge of the room and placed her hand gently on the mirrored wall. The reflection shimmered, and for the briefest moment, no longer than the span of a held breath, Miss Marple saw herself among the dancers. She blinked. The image vanished. Irene turned, her voice low. "Would you like to know how the final hour ends?" "No," Miss Marple replied firmly. "I'm far more interested in how it began." And with that, the chandelier dimmed to half its light. The mirrors dulled. The guests, every one of them, collapsed to the floor, not unconscious, not lifeless, but as if woken from a trance. They looked at one another in confusion. The piano, for the first time in hours, fell silent. Miss Marple was the last standing, and when she turned toward the portrait once more, it had returned to its original state. Irene was gone, Dr. Langley too. In their place, two faceless dancers, mid-step. If you've been watching closely, listening even closer, you may already suspect where the music is leading next. What would you do if the portrait changed to show your reflection? What secrets are worth a final hour's waltz? If you've stayed with us this far, we invite you politely, of course, to subscribe so you don't miss the last steps of this haunting dance.
Chapter 7. The Unmasking. The air in the ballroom had never been lighter, yet never so charged. Candlelight no longer danced upon crystal, but traced every line of tension across every face still standing, faces drained of ceremony, freed from performance, finally visible in their rawness. Nothing seemed out of place until it suddenly was. 24 masked figures, gowns of velvet and lace, stood frozen under the chandelier's half-light, their breaths caught between rhythm and reason. Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the parquet floor, cleared her throat, her voice soft but steady, measured to carry. "Friends, I ask your attention," she began. "We have come here under the guise of a waltz, of a revival, of history, yet the music has never been mere melody. It has been the means of binding, shall we say, souls." A murmur rippled through the group, one that grew as she continued. "Irene Vale is no gentle music teacher. She is Genevieve, the woman who led séances here, under this very roof, and first invoked the widow's dance in 1902. She paused, eyes travelling across the crowd. "Genevieve is preserved by ritual waltzing and by blood offerings. She survives, unchanged, by feeding the rhythm, by drawing life into the cycle. Masks, mirrors, music, they have bound us as well." All eyes turned toward Irene, who remained still, mask in hand, as though it were a relic she revered, not war. The guests shifted uneasily. Sebastian, pale but determined, nodded once at Miss Marple, as if sealing the accusation. "This," Marple said, sweeping her gaze back across the room, "is no longer celebration, it is captivity. Guests are collapsing. Flickers of ghosts appear in reflections. Memories are etched into wood, stone and minds. The music chooses its dancers, and some never leave." She let the weight of her words settle over them like a final chord. Irene stepped forward then, mask raised, eyes unblinking, her voice calm. "You have guessed correctly. The music chose me, centuries ago. My lineage kept the secret, preserved the ceremony, so the melody would not fade. I am both performer and instrument. I am the waltzing widow." A single gasp rose, then all quieted, waiting for more. "This ritual," Miss Marple added quietly, "repeats until the piano is finished. But the piano itself is the instrument of entrapment. Its wood came from a shipwreck, where dozens drowned mid-dance in a storm so violent it claimed every life aboard. The sound of that tragedy pulses in every chord." Irene smiled faintly, as though amused. "Yes, the piano is the heart, and if it plays its final note, the binding ends." Miss Marple stepped toward the instrument, then pivoted toward the guests. "There is no safe alibi, no avoidance here. Break the piano, and you break the spell. She lifted a fire poker from a nearby sconce. For a moment, silence fell so heavy it might have been woven from the memory of that ship's final gale. No one moved. Then Lady Anstruther exhaled. A single tear glistened in her lamp-lit cheek. "It is our home," she whispered. "It is my legacy." "Your legacy has become a masquerade of vengeance," Miss Marple replied gently. She raised the poker, held it poised above the polished surface. A moment, then strike. The piano's lid splintered. A sharp crack reverberated. The guests recoiled. Irene hissed, half protest, half pleasure. Second strike. The sound was brutal, echoing. Seams of wood fractured like aching bones. Third strike. Then the room seemed to hold its breath. At the moment of the third blow, the air thickened, not with dust or debris, but with a strange pressure, like a room suddenly filled with unsaid truths. The chandelier trembled above them, its crystals shivering, not from wind but from something more internal. An echo struck deep in the bones of Eversfield Hall. The piano gave a long, low groan, part mechanical, part something else entirely, and the final string snapped with a whip-like shriek that sent several guests stumbling back. Then the sound, sharp, immediate, and unnatural. Crack, one mirror, shatter, two more. Around the hall, the looking glasses that lined the gilded walls fractured in sequence, as though responding to the ruin of the instrument they had long reflected. Slivers of silvered glass split in spider-veined lines, freezing the ghostly dancers mid-step, freezing Irene's image in 1,000 broken shards. Guests flinched, gasped, shielded their faces. Some cried out, others simply froze, stunned by the impossible synchrony of it all. At the far end of the ballroom, a gust of air neither cold nor warm passed from nowhere. Lady Anstruther fell into a nearby chair, her hand trembling against her throat. Sebastian shouted something, unintelligible, but the moment had seized control from all of them now. Irene remained upright, still, her face expressionless. Miss Marple watched her carefully, poker now lowered, fingers tight against its soot-blackened handle. Her gaze flicked to the cracked portrait behind the broken piano. The canvas, untouched for decades, had changed. The ballroom dancers, once faceless and soft-brushed, now bore clarity, features precise, attire updated, and among them, unmistakable, Dr. Langley, his eyes wide, caught mid-step, and beside him, Irene, no longer obscured, no longer young. "You see it now," Miss Marple said, softly but clearly enough for those near her to hear. "The portrait has kept them." Irene, Genevieve, lifted her chin, but not in defiance. Her expression, for the first time, wavered, and then something else. Movement, a slow rise of air, a sound, a voice, no, many, a melody, not played but remembered, a whispered tune, one passed on, not by score or recital, but by memory and ritual and the silence of mirrors. One guest clutched their chest, eyes wide, another backed away toward the double doors, only to find them, of course, locked once again from the inside, as if the room itself had unfinished business. As if the dance had not yet ended. "She's not alone," came a voice from the stairwell. It was Major Beckwith, his shirt misbuttoned, his mouth slack, his eyes closed. He was sleepwalking. Again, he moved forward, feet gliding across the floorboards in unmistakable three-quarter time, lips moving as if reciting a verse remembered in childhood. Miss Marple turned to the group. "Do not let it take you. The piano," she added sharply, "was the heart, but the house remembers the rhythm." Then from the shadows, footsteps, not from anyone seen, but layered, delayed, as though catching up from a distance not measured in feet, but in years. A mirror cracked once more, this one untouched by hand or hammer. "This ritual," said Miss Marple quietly, "wants to finish what it started, but we must change the ending." The mirrors had fallen quiet. Their splintered faces now reflected only fragments of costumes, of faces twisted in uncertainty, of a ballroom that had lost its melody but not its menace. The silence was the kind that does not comfort. It pressed, it questioned, and for those who had danced, even once, it lingered. Irene, Genevieve, stepped forward. The brooch on her bodice caught the glint of a gas lamp, identical to the one found clutched in the bony hand beneath the ballroom floor.
She no longer spoke in riddles, nor in misdirection. Her voice, when it came, was almost weary. "I told you," she said, "eyes not on Miss Marple, but on the room itself. The music chooses, it remembers, and it never forgets its dancers." Miss Marple did not reply immediately. She had seen grief wear many masks: rage, delusion, devotion. But what she saw now, on Genevieve's face, was none of those. It was legacy, the quiet tragedy of someone who had chosen not to leave a place because it was the last to remember her. "But you fed it," Miss Marple said at last, voice low, "with people, with memory, with mirrors." "To stay," Genevieve replied. "I had to." The guests stood motionless, unsure whether to flee or listen. The spell, if that was the word, had not broken. It had shifted, fractured, but remained in place like a breath waiting to be exhaled. At that moment, Lady Anstruther lifted something from her lap, a photograph, torn, aged, and now cracked by broken glass, but unmistakable. It showed a much younger version of herself, standing beside her mother, in the very ballroom where they now stood. In the background, nearly faded, the figure of a woman by the piano, Genevieve. Not aged, not altered. "She taught me the waltz," Lady Anstruther whispered. "I thought she was a servant. I never questioned why she looked the same every year." The truth was not shouted. There was no dramatic confession, no brutal rage, nor violent reaction. The revelation passed through the room like a sigh, soft, undeniable, and heavy. "Irene Vale never existed," Miss Marple said. "She was a name borrowed. What remained was Genevieve, bound here by music and mirrors, sustained by belief and repetition." At this, Sebastian, until now silent, spoke. "You told me the music helped you sleep," he said to her. Genevieve smiled. "It helped you forget." He staggered back as if remembering more than he wished. "Then why the piano?" someone asked. "Why destroy it?" Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "Because it was never merely an instrument. It was the first anchor, made from the wood of a shipwreck, where men and women danced to keep calm as waves swallowed them. It absorbed fear, memory, and rhythm. That timber learned to remember." The final word hung in the air. Remember. And still there was the portrait. All eyes turned again to it. The figures had not changed since the piano's breaking. But Miss Marple stepped closer now, narrowing her gaze. "There," she said. A corner of the painting had curled with age or heat, revealing a second layer beneath. She reached out and peeled it back gently. Underneath, a hidden detail. A mask in the hand of the woman painted as Genevieve. But not the porcelain face she wore at the masquerade. It was a man's face. Beckwith's. The implication, unspoken, rang through every heart. Genevieve had not danced alone, and someone else had joined willingly. But who? As the chapter draws toward its close, the guests finally spoke. Soft voices, quiet questions, the first stirrings of sense and suspicion. Miss Marple, however, said nothing more. She watched the room, the broken piano, the mirrors, and above all, Genevieve. "She's not finished," she thought. "Not yet." And as if in answer, a sound from beneath the floorboards, faint, familiar, footsteps, in perfect waltz time.
Chapter 8. Last Waltz in Eversfield. Morning arrived at Eversfield Hall, not with sunlight, but with a hush so absolute it might have washed away nights of music, mirth, and madness. The corridors lay empty, gallery doors swung on slow hinges, and the walls, long stained by candle smoke and whispered rites, seemed suddenly bare, stripped of their long-held memories. Outside, horses waited for departure in silence. The surviving guests, their faces ashen and eyes hollow, filed past Miss Marple one by one, their steps measured, their futures uncertain. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was. In Lady Anstruther's study, discovered by the housekeeper at dawn, she sat upright in her chair, an unread book on her lap, a gentle smile on her lips, and no breath in her chest. On the small table beneath the portrait, a waltz record lay spinning, though the gramophone lay silent, no power, no needle. The vinyl rotated of its own accord. The staff dared only whisper among themselves. Legacy, inheritance, secrets exposed, none named outright what the record signified, yet all understood it had no place in a world where music needed no mechanism. Irene, Genevieve, was nowhere to be found. Her belongings, costumes, sad relics of centuries, had vanished. The hidden room lay undisturbed, mannequins gone, ledger gone, secrets hidden once more in dust. Only the remnants of ritual remained. Shards of mask, broken glass, a dried rose beneath a fallen mirror. Miss Marple made her way to the ballroom, now empty, its floor reclaimed by a fresh layer of dust. She paused at the entrance, gazing across the scene. The splintered piano, the shattered mirrors glinting in dawn's grey light, the chandelier hanging like a silent witness. In the centre lay the torn music sheet, the widow's dance, its last bar now complete, the ink darker, flowing effortlessly across the final measure. Beneath it scrawled in crimson ink, "The dance is over, but the music it never ends." She knelt, picked up the sheet, and felt the fragile weight of centuries in her hand, memory preserved in pigment, rhythm cemented in marginalia. Dust rose gently as the first sunlight crept over her shawl and illuminated the paper. In the cracked mirror by the doorway, she saw herself, dressed in that modest gown, hands folded, but behind her, faint and shifting, the outline of a ballroom dress appeared, the flash of a mask. She turned. Nothing remained but the echo of something just past. The mirror blurred, then cleared, and in that moment, with her reflection snapping back to normalcy, she understood that Eversfield Hall had performed its final act, not for them, but for itself. The house would remember, until memory was gone. The music would echo in glass, wood and dust. She rose, folded the music sheet, placed it in her coat, and with careful steps, exited the ballroom, leaving behind the last visible trace of ritual.